used of the Lord in a pagan cabinet, a pagan government. He served Babylonia like it was his own. It wasn't. He was faithful to Nebuchadnezzar and other kings and elevated in their cabinet. He was a trustworthy man. He was a dependable man. We know from chapter 1 and verse 17 he had a gift of being able to understand visions. And this Daniel in chapter 7 starts another portion of his book where he backtracks and begins to tell of his own visions. In the earlier chapters, he's interpreting other visions or the handwriting on the wall and so on like that. And that, the first 6 chapters kind of goes basically chronological. And then Daniel chapter 7 begins a bit of a backtrack, and he begins to emphasize that I saw, verse 2 of chapter 7, I saw. He's relating to us that he's not telling us something that somebody else saw and he interpreted. I saw this. And we made the point last week that it would seem like the general history of mankind is that of a downward progression. I believe that same thing from creation to the flood, that you see a general downward trend of man. And it gets to Genesis chapter 6, which is about 1,500 years after creation, and the Lord says, I'm not going to put up with this. Their thoughts are only evil continually. I'm going to flood the earth. Noah and his wife, their 3 sons and their wives, will be in the ark, plus all the prescribed animals. But it was the result of a downward trend of mankind, and the morality that just over time evaporates. And that's historically what the human experience is. And since then, and understand, there are many revivals. There are times when God is brought to the forefront and things are great again. David and Solomon's kingdom, it was a wonderful time. And then the kings were good and bad and bad and bad and good once in a while, and a downward spiral. And the history of humanity is traditionally that. Now, if you could look at a chart from a distance, it would start up on a pinnacle and it would come down, and there would be spots where it would come back up and spots where it would come back up and down. But the overall trajectory is down. And certainly this nation coming onto the scene and establishing itself on biblical principles was certainly a high spot, and certainly a slow in the decline. But all in all, it is still a continual and steady decline. And what Daniel saw in chapter 7 was things getting from bad to worse to terrible, and what we'll see tonight is to the Antichrist coming, until the Ancient of Days comes and sorts it all out and settles it all down. But Daniel chapter 7 and verse 1, let's read the first 8 verses. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head upon his bed. Then he wrote the dream and told the sum of the matters. Daniel spake and said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of the heavens strove upon the great sea, and 4 great beasts came up from the sea, diverse one from another. And the first one was like a lion and had eagle's wings, and I beheld till the wings were plucked. The wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth and made stand upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second, like to a bear. It raised up itself on one side, and it had 3 ribs in the mouth of it, between the teeth of it. And they said thus unto it, Arise, devour much flesh. After this I beheld, and lo, another, like a leopard, which had upon the back of it 4 wings of a fowl. The beast had also 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, and strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth. It devoured and brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with the feet of it. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it. And it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of man, and a mouth speaking great things. We won't go any farther tonight. Our focus will be on verse 8 after we do a little bit of reviewing of these beasts. He makes mention that it's my vision, and I'm seeing this. He makes mention that it's in the first year of Belshazzar, which backs the time clock up probably 15 to 20 years. Daniel's probably about 70 years old right now. And so it's a bit of a backtrack to come back, and now Daniel in chapter 7 begins to enter into the more prophetic portion of the book, where the first 6 verses are the more historical portions of the book. And Daniel beheld in verse 2 4 winds of the heaven strove upon the great sea. And we made the case last week that it's easy to point out that the great sea is the sea of humanity. And we know that these beasts rise up as humans, and so because we read in verse 17, these great beasts, which are 4 kings, which shall arise out of the earth. So the way that Revelation uses the sea of humanity in a couple different places, I think it's chapter 17, verse 15, and the beginning of chapter 13, and it talks about what we would call the sea of humanity. And that's the sea in view here in verse 2. And the 4 winds of heaven strove upon the sea of humanity. So what you see in verse 2 is that God's in charge. What you see in verse 2 is that the 4 winds of heaven are stirring. What you see in verse 2 is all that takes place is under the sovereign control of God. All that is going on is at very least within the sovereign permission of God. You cannot lose sight of that these 4 winds from heaven, strove upon the sea of humanity. And so it's the moving of God, or at least, as I say, by the permission of God, that this is all taking place. And 4 beasts come up. And we know from verse 17 he's having reference to 4 kings and 4 kingdoms. And we made mention of this, that Daniel's vision is in parallel with Nebuchadnezzar's image, and the 4 first kingdoms are involved that are the same. And historically, we know who the 4 are. Historically, Daniel looked at Nebuchadnezzar and said, "Thou art the head of gold." So we know the first kingdom is the Babylonian kingdom. There's no question about that. We know that the kingdom that took over from Babylon is the Medo-Persian Empire. There's no question about that. These are historical facts. We know that who took over the Medo-Persian Empire was the Greek Empire, and under Alexander the Great's leadership. And there's no question to those things. They're historical facts. We know that from there, Rome took over. These things are just historic evidence. And so when people surmise the various parts and pieces of Nebuchadnezzar's image, they use those 4 kingdoms because, and it's just a provable, citable thing that you can say this kingdom followed this kingdom followed this kingdom, and it fits Nebuchadnezzar's image very well. Daniel's image is in parallel with that, or the images of the four beasts, Daniel's vision, is in parallel with that, and it goes further. It builds upon that, and that's important because we take some of the things that we learned from Nebuchadnezzar's image and build upon it with Daniel's four beasts. And so it's like a big puzzle. Maybe it's a poor analogy, but you find a piece here and you find a piece there, and you see how they fit together, because Daniel interprets things from Nebuchadnezzar's dreams, and we learn some things from that. Daniel sees these four beasts, and we learn some things from that. And then in the book of Revelation, we've already studied some things about the Antichrist and about the kingdoms that will arise, and how that the Antichrist will come onto the scene and just seem like he puts everything in place, and he strikes a 3.5-year deal. Well, he strikes a deal and brokers a peace deal, but in 3.5 years he throws that out the window, and he emerges as the Antichrist who makes war with the saints. And you put all these pieces together, and it becomes more and more clear. These four beasts, one was a lion, one was a bear, and of course the lion, I believe, was the Babylonian Empire, the bear, the Medo-Persian Empire, the leopard, the Greek Empire, and then fourthly, the unnamed beast, which we find in verse 7. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast. He didn't have a name for it. It wasn't like a lion or bear or leopard or a tiger. It was something so different. He didn't have a name to put an image to it. He just called it a beast. It was dreadful and terrible and strong exceedingly. And it had great iron teeth. And it devoured and brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with the feet of it, and was diverse from all the beasts which were before it. And it had 10 horns. And that 10 horns shows up a lot in book of Revelation, and most tie it to some sort of a 10-part union confederation that is brought together. Not even going to try to speculate. I don't think we should try to speculate on what 10 entities make up this 10-state union or 10-piece confederacy. All the commentators, well, a lot of the commentators say it's these 10 and they've come and gone, and then other ones say it's these 10 and they've come and gone, and some others say it's these 10 and half of those are gone, and it's not important. The Lord knows when His timetable is going to unfold. But I'm just making the point that 10 toes, or in this case 10 horns, we've had that number emerge several times. What I wanted to get into today, after reminding you that things in Daniel's dream go from one ferocious beast to another, being stirred of the four winds of heaven. So this is all of God's doings. He raises up one kingdom, and then He raises up another to devour it. He raises up another to devour that one. He has a purpose and a plan for all that He's doing. But one ferocious kingdom devours another ferocious kingdom, which devours another ferocious kingdom. And here the fourth kingdom comes along, the fourth beast comes along, and it's different than all the rest and worse than all the rest. And he doesn't even have anything to tie it to as far as a mental picture by way of a name. He just calls it a beast. And my point in bringing that up to you is our hope is not going to be in a kingdom, or our hope is not going to be in a government. Our hope is not going to be political. Our hope is not going to be a country. I'm glad for our country, and I'm glad for the freedoms that she's afforded us. I'm glad for maybe the fact that our country did slow the downward spiral just a little bit as a nation built on God's Word. But our hope is not in this country or any other country. We'll see next week, Lord willing. Our hope is in God. So these beasts are arising out of the sea of humanity, one after another. The fourth one comes up. It's different from all the rest. And in verse 8, he's considering it. He's considering the 10 horns, which rose up out of the fourth beast. That was dreadful and terrible. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn. The little horn rose up. Now, he's pondering this, he's considering it, and there was a little horn. Now, I don't believe that the horn stays little. I don't believe that the horn stays of low impact. I think it is of major impact. And I think the text will develop that thought. But it starts out in Daniel's vision little. Now you think of something little. It was a little accident. It just creased a fender. It was a little spot that they found that they can easily get rid of. Something that's little. It's not that big a deal. It's not anything to get too concerned about, at first at least. This was a little horn, and it rose up, came onto the scene slowly maybe, softly maybe, came onto the scene and didn't appear at first to be any problem. You will see as this unfolds, I believe, that is a perfect analogy of the Antichrist coming onto the scene as he brokers a deal, as he negotiates peace, and seems fine. Everything, I mean, it's great. Who wouldn't want it? And then the true colors come out. And then you realize that one who seemed like everything he was doing was good is actually going to be bad. The little horn rose up. And we're going to look at that tonight. We're going to see how it comes up softly. And notice that we see right in our text in verse 8, before whom were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. He gets destructive. And we see that not only there, but in verse 20, we see 3 fell. And of the 10 horns that were in his head, and of the other which came up, the little horn which came up, and before them 3 fell. So we have verse 8, it says plucked up. Verse 20 says 3 other horns fell. 3 kingdoms fell. Verse 24, the very last phrase, and he shall be diverse from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings. So as this vision more and more unfolds, we see this little horn toppling 3 other kingdoms. 3 or plucked up, or they fell, or they were subdued. Either way, you have this one coming out on top. You have this one rising up. Verse 20 would seem to indicate, let's read verse 20 at after the colon, the semicolon there, even of that horn that had eyes and a mouth and spake very great things, whose look was more stout than his fellows. I believe that has reference to an arrogance about him. His look was more stern, stout, arrogant. And that will fit it will fit in my understanding of what the Antichrist would look like. So this little horn comes onto the scene and he's destructive. But he doesn't seem destructive at first because he's a little horn. It's just not that big a deal. The little horn had, in our text, verse 8, behold, I'm nearly to the end of the verse, behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. The eyes of a man. He's not beastly in his eyes. He's not beastly in his appearance. He's beastly in his actions. But his eyes are the eyes of a man, with his mouth speaking great and swelling things. This little horn, I want to develop that a little bit, speaks great things. We see that in verse 8. Verse 11, I beheld then because of the voice of the great words which the horn spake. This one that rises, that Daniel saw in his vision, will speak great swelling, arrogant things. This one who rises will be a master orator and be able to influence the masses. So much so that Daniel says, I beheld then. I studied this. I observed. I watched this because of the voice of the great words which the horn spake. I noticed his great and swelling oratory. I noticed his arrogant words. It got Daniel's attention. This one who rose up after the first three and puts them down. This one who rose up, a little horn, just a little guy at first. He beheld because of his arrogant speech. Verse 20 and B, the end of it, even that of the horn, even that horn that had eyes and a mouth that spake very great things. It's something that really captured Daniel's attention. He spoke very great things. Let's chase that just a little bit. He's speaking great things. In what venue? About what? About whom? What? Verse 25 begins to explain a little more about that. Verse 25, and he shall speak great words against the Most High. Now that's something that'll get Daniel's attention. Daniel, a servant of the Most High God, has now the opportunity to observe one who is speaking great things against the Most High. Daniel's taking notice. Daniel is observing. In verse 11, I beheld because of the voice of the great words. This is something that gets Daniel's attention. Speaks against the Most High. That's arrogant, to speak against God. Hold your finger here in Daniel and go to Revelation chapter 13 with me, and you'll begin to see, I believe, a parallel. Revelation 13 and verse 5. And we know that we have in chapter 12 and so on in this section, we've begun to see John tell us about the Antichrist. We've begun to see the players of this brewing battle. The beast that is the Antichrist, the beast that John calls him so often, the coming world ruler. He'll come at first speaking words of peace. He will end up being a source of destruction. until he himself is destroyed. But about him, this is what is stated, and there was, Revelation 13:5, and there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months. Who is that? The Antichrist. And we'll run into that well-documented time period. We find it in the Bible. Time, times, and halftime. We find it in the Bible in so many different ways that ends up 3.5 years. And we find in Revelation chapter 13 and verse 5 that the one who is given 42 months, 3.5 years, the Antichrist, is speaking great and blasphemous words against God. You see how the pieces begin to fit together. And this little horn, who starts out little and seemingly harmless, begins to speak great and swelling words. And as that thought develops, they're words that are against God, against the Most High. In verse 25 even of our text, back in our text, and if you want to keep your finger in Revelation 13, we'll maybe be back there if we have time. But back in our text, Daniel 7, verse 25, he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High. Shall wear out the saints of the Most High. Verse 21 says in our text, I beheld the same horn made war with the saints, and prevailed against them. Go back to Revelation 13. Revelation 13. I kind of warned you. And I want to read now chapter 13, verses 5 through 8. And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months. And he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, and them that dwell in heaven. It was given unto him to make war with the saints. What did we just read in in Daniel 7:21? He made war with the saints. John is telling us of this one who made war with the saints. He opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, blasphemed his name and his tabernacle, and them that dwell in heaven. It was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. We know who John is talking about. The Antichrist. John uses some of the exact language that Daniel uses to describe this little horn, seemingly insignificant at first, seemingly harmless at first, little horn. So we find in our text in Daniel 7 that, let's go back and read verse 25 some more. He shall speak great words against the Most High, shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws. Remember, he spoke blasphemies against God and against the tabernacle. He seeks to change everything. He seeks to change times and laws. There's a lot of supposition as to what's going on in times and laws, but he's trying to rewrite pretty much everything. The common thread agrees on changing what God says is right and wrong. Well, that's going on every day. That's a part of the steady decline of the morality of men. But under his leadership, it's got turbo rockets going downhill mightily fast. So we know that this little horn We may not know all the players and all the specific components and the 10 Confederate nations and some of those details. It's not really relevant. We may not, and I don't think we even should try to identify some of the specific components, because if you read a commentator from 400 years ago, they're identifying people from their time frame. And if you read a commentator from 200 years ago, they're trying to identify people from their time frame. And if somebody writes a commentary from this time frame, they're identifying the nations that are on the scene now. The point is not who they are. The point is that the four winds of heaven, controlled by God, stirs up the sea of humanity, and He does as He pleases with kingdoms. He raises them up and He brings them down. He devours one with another and another and another until the Antichrist comes onto the scene and begins to say, I got it all. I got all the answers. I'm going to settle it all down. Everything's fine. Comes on as a little horn. Doesn't seem like he's a big deal. And turns out to be very destructive. Speaking great swelling words. Well, there's nothing abnormal about that, except he's speaking great swelling words against God. And that's not going to go on. He's speaking great blasphemies against God. In Revelation 13, we read against the tabernacle, against His place of worship, against His system of worship. And he seeks to change it all. He wants to rewrite all of it. There's a rewriting going on of our moral compass every day. There's a rewriting going on of what's right and what's wrong. I mean, who would have ever thought that even in my short lifetime as a young man, I would have never believed that you would have to define what makes a marriage. That you would have to define the components of a home. Who would have ever believed that would have been already rewritten in the time frame of a generation, that those things have been, in the minds of many, redefined, changed. And that's just the beginning. We know, again, we don't know all the players, but we can see that this little horn fits into the Scriptures very nicely as one that John would call the beast, later identified as the Antichrist. That one who will rule the world briefly. That one who will be overthrown by God Himself. And we read in our text in Daniel 7, and I knew we'd never get to it today, but we read in our text of the Ancient of Days and His Son. And we know that that's our only hope. One thing that's painfully clear out of Daniel chapter 7. Our hope is not in governments. Not in our government, not in any government. I'm thankful for our government. And I have definite opinions on who I think will do a better job. But that's not where my hope is. My hope is in the one coming that will put down every opposing entity. My hope is in the Ancient of Days and His Son. 2 Timothy 3 tells us that suffering for Christ and the decline of morality is going to be the way of life. 2 Timothy chapter 3 verse 11 through 13. Persecutions, afflictions, which came unto me at Antioch and Iconium and Lystra, what persecutions I endured, but out of them all the Lord delivered me. Yea, and all that will live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. And to one extent or another, that has been the lot of humanity. And again, I'm thankful to be in this blessed land where that kind of persecution is at its lowest ebb here than anywhere on the face of the earth. And I'm thankful for living here. But evil men and seducers shall wax worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. The general course of humanity is going to go in a downward trend. And no government's going to fix that. Only the Lord's going to fix that. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 3. For when they say peace and safety, and that was the mantra in the Old Testament, the prophets were coming along and saying, the Lord will judge, the Lord will judge, turn your ways around, the Lord will judge. The prophets of God said that. Other false prophets come along and said, it's fine, everything's fine, the barns are full, the harvest is great, everything's fine, peace and safety. What does it say? For when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them. A destruction that you can't get away from. It's like verse 3, travail upon a woman with child. You're not going to get away from it. You will go through it. And of course, in 2 Thessalonians, he tells of a steady falling away. Probably turn over one page and see it in chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. Let no man deceive you by any means. For that day, the day of the Lord, the day of the Antichrist being revealed, they're in close proximity one to another, but that end time that is so apocalyptic, that day, it's not going to happen. Verse 2. Where did I stop? Let's start in verse 2 again. That ye not be soon shaken, that ye be not soon shaken in mind or troubled, neither by spirit, nor by word, nor by letter as from us, as that the day of Christ is at hand. Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. So you see this blasphemy, that he opposes and exalteth himself above all that is called God or worshipped, speaking great and swelling things. We'll go back to Daniel quickly and wrap this up for tonight. In Daniel chapter 7, of course, what effect did this have on Daniel? I mean, we read a couple of times where he pondered, he studied, he beheld, he observed. Verse 15, I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit, in the midst of my body. His body from its core was shaken. The visions of my head troubled me. Again, the supposition varies on why he was grieved. The next verse talks about wanting to know more and learning more, and made me to know the interpretation of the things. The grieving may in part be a getting to the point where he understands it all and sees it all. I suspect that some of the grieving in his spirit is, wow, what a row to hoe. What historical trouble there is going to be. What kind of this beast devours, this beast devours. Wow. Daniel may have been taken back by the destruction, by the devouring, by the image of the beast doing the devouring. And apart, if you stop there, it would be very hopeless in its result. He sees Christ, and he sees Christ coming, and he sees the Ancient of Days and the Son come, and he knows that that's where the hope is. But between now and then, wow, I'm in the first kingdom. Well, now I'm in the second kingdom. Babylon has fallen. I'm in the second kingdom. Wow. It's just one devouring kingdom after another devouring kingdom after another devouring kingdom. And the whole thing troubles him. But he gives us hope. He gets the answer to this, and he comes back at the end of the chapter and shows us the Ancient of Days and how that he wins, how that he restores. But it's a heavy dream. It has very heavy implications. But the general tenor of it is this. Things may go from worse to worser to terrible to the Lord returning. And he'll set it all straight. And so my hope is in the Lord. My hope is in him, not in man. Oh, I have definite political opinions and definite thankfulness to be able to be blessed to live in this country. But my hope is not in these things. My main hope is not in these things. My hope is in the Lord. I pray that you can trust him, you can look to him in faith and just cast your anchor in him. And your anchor holds in him. Let's stand. Brother Jerry, would you dismiss